All right, good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books and More, and Charis is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Yeah, you can clap for that. We are so proud to kick off Women's History Month with this very special conversation between author and historian Ruby Law and essayist and author Anjali Enjeti about Law's brand new book, Vagabond Princess, The Great Adventures of Gulbadan. Vagabond Princess is a captivating biography of one of the world's greatest adventurers, the itinerant Mughal princess Gulbadan, based on her long-forgotten memoir. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by Raksha Inc. Raksha's mission, yes. Raksha's mission is to promote a stronger and healthier South Asian community through confidential support services, education, and advocacy. Raksha works towards healing, empowerment, and justice for survivors of violence. And we have the executive director of Raksha with us tonight, Aparna. Thank you always for your friendship and for being here. Every event we do with you is better. So thank you. At Charis, we celebrate Women's History Month both for the joy of discovering hidden stories, such as Princess Gulbadan's, as well as for what those histories can teach us about our contemporary moment. At a time when our information moves faster than ever, we can feel ever more distant from one another. Histories like the one Dr. Law has produced help us remember our place in the long timeline of human belonging and call us to action in solidarity with our siblings around the globe. For those of us residing in the United States, we hope that you will use your power to call for an immediate permanent ceasefire in Gaza. We encourage you, this Women's History Month in particular, to be transformed by our histories, of courage to work for peace, justice, and liberation for all people in our lifetimes. We'll now introduce tonight's conversation partner, Anjali Enjeti. Anjali is an Atlanta-based former attorney, journalist, and organizer. She's the author of Southbound, Essays on Identity, Inheritance, and Social Change, and The Parted Earth. She is the winner of the Georgia Author of the Year for First Novel, a gold medal recipient for Best Regional Nonfiction in the Independent Publisher Book Awards, and was a finalist for the Townsend Prize for Fiction. Her other writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Boston Globe, and elsewhere. She teaches creative writing in the MFA programs at Antioch University in Los Angeles and Reinhardt University. And of course, the woman of the hour is Ruby Law. Ruby is an acclaimed historian of India and a professor of South Asian history at Emory University, as well as the author of 3 books and numerous essays, op-eds, and literary pieces. Her most recent book before this was Empress, The Astonishing Reign of Nur Jahan, which won the Georgia Author of the Year Award in Biography and was a finalist in history for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Law taught previously at the Johns Hopkins University, where she directed the program for the study of women, gender, and sexuality. And this book, Vagabond Princess, has already received incredible advanced praise. So from Kirkus Review to Ms. Magazine, all kinds of folks are holding this book up as an incredible work of scholarship, an accessible work of scholarship. The BBC, Spectator, it has been named as, one of the top nonfiction books to look out for. So we are very honored to get to help to celebrate its birth into the world, especially at such an important time in our collective history. We really do believe that stories change lives and that by learning from the past, we can have a better future. So everyone will have an opportunity to ask questions. If you're physically here in the room with us tonight, you may raise your hand during the question and answer session, and I will bring you a microphone. If you're watching along with us online, please feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time, and we will share them with the room when the time comes. Once again, thank you all for sharing your evening with us. Please put your hands together once more for Anjali Enjeti and Ruby Law.
Introduction of our featured author, and thank you for your statement of solidarity with the Palestinians. I would just like to remind everyone that we are actually in the middle of an election right now. It is the presidential primary election. Early voting is still on Thursday and Friday of this week. Election day is March the 12th. There is a movement of activists and organizers in Georgia who are part of the Leave It Blank movement. They are asking that voters ask for a Democratic ballot at their polls and leave it blank when they cast the ballot. This is a protest vote to send a message to the Biden administration that we want a ceasefire and an end to the genocide. So please do that. And you have questions about doing that, you can talk to me after you've purchased your book, this extraordinary book, and I can answer your questions and let you know how to get involved in the volunteer movement. I am so honored to be here with our author. This was an extraordinary read for me, and it was actually really difficult for me to come up with some questions. But I think to get the feel for how beautifully it's written, we will ask Ruby to read a short selection from the book so that you can get a sense of this astounding story of a really wonderful princess.
Thank you, Anjali. First of all, I'm just so honored and delighted to be at Caris once more. Thank you, ER, and your wonderful staff. Women's History Month, but also this is my first event in my hometown. I've been all over, but I'm delighted that Caris is hosting this. Thank you to Raksha, to all of you who are here, and especially to you, Anjali. I think it's a great honor for me to be in conversation with you. So I'm going to read from really the first page and a half to set the scene for our conversation. August 1997, the British Library, London. I waited with nervous anticipation as I skimmed through the card catalogue in the tall wooden cabinets behind the service desk of the Asian and African Studies reading room. A majestic, high-ceilinged rectangular room, it had several long tables, each of which could comfortably seat up to 4 readers on each side. Lamps with light blue shades stood in contrast to the yellow tables. Large portraits of Indian Rajas and other aristocrats from the former British colonies dominated one side of the high walls. Rows of bookshelves holding printed guides and other catalogues drew the patrons' attention. Every now and then, the library staff looked toward the area where readers pored over the special collections. Earlier in the day, I had asked to see the 16th century Princess Gulbadan book. Gulbadan Begum is her name, and the book was classified as Oriental 166 in the library. Gulbadan, literally Rosebody, was the beloved daughter of Babur, the patriarch of the magnificent Mughals of India, and the first and only woman historian of the Mughal Empire. Writing events as they unfolded, she captured the gritty and fabulous daily lives of ambitious men, subversive women, brilliant eunuchs, devoted nurses, gentle and perceptive guards, and captive women and children who died in war zones. Yet, Gulbadan's stellar book was relegated to the margins of history, to mere footnotes in volumes on Mughal politics, war, economy, and agrarian histories, all written by men. Before I left India for Oxford, so this is the time of my graduate work in 1997, before I left India for Oxford, I had seen a 1902 English translation of Gulbadan's work by Annette Beveridge, a British colonial era scholar. It was obvious that Gulbadan was a woman of many quests and journeys, yet her work had been sidelined by modern historians who shared Beveridge's publisher's belief, articulated in a letter accepting the translation for publication, that it was, that is, Gulbadan's book was, of unique interest, a little history. It is but a little thing. So the little history of men's and women's daily lives that enraptured the princess is in fact a masterpiece that came out of an insightful witnessing of hard politics and much more. No distant bystander, she was close to the people she lived and she chronicled. Thus her book was both hers and theirs, a lively prose work that shines with unrivaled granular details of Mughal wandering life. So on that August 1997 morning, as I waited to hold the book of this adventurous woman, I did not yet know the depth of her radical thinking, her daring life story, tied intricately to one of the greatest adventures in the late 16th century world. 2 decades would pass before I joined together the pieces of a fascinating life. And it is this here.
That was so beautiful. So you mentioned 2 decades of being obsessed about the princess's life. How do you go from that into deciding to then write a biography?
Yeah, so as a graduate student, when I studied her memoir, the memoir became the centerpiece of my first academic book called Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World. Women's History Month. I'm the solo feminist Mughal historian. It was the first feminist history of the Mughal world, and you got a sense of that as I was reading. That book, that first academic book, actually ended with Gulbadan, by this time a senior matriarch, an itinerant woman who had always been on the road, but by the time of the reign of her nephew, Akbar the Great, she's been asked by this grand monarch, her nephew, to live behind the harem walls. And she's not the only one. It's generations of itinerant peripatetic women have been asked to do this. So why the harem? Because, by this time, Akbar said, no more wandering of peripatetic forefathers. We need to be grand. We need to be settled. We need to look great. And part of the grandness was also, to actually show the women as sacred and inaccessible. So the intention was a good one, but that meant translated as seclusion. So this much I had kind of shown in the book, and also shown that going out from the sacred walled harem was in fact a gorgeous cerebral act within the terms of what was available to Gulbadan. So that was that book, and then I went on to do other books. The last one that, of course, Garris launched, Empress: The Astonishing Reign of Noor Jahan. And so when I was on the road with Noor Jahan, people kept on, because Gulbadan is leaving for Western Arabia, and this woman who's going to be the only woman Mughal co-sovereign, Noor Jahan, is making her way into her nephew's empire as a baby girl in the arms of her parents. They were migrants from Persia. So readers who had read my book got very attracted to Gulbadan, and they kept on asking me in those events around Empress, who is Gulbadan? Tell us more about Gulbadan. So as those questions kept coming up, there were two things I had been attracted to right from the start, but I hadn't paid attention to. One was that her manuscript breaks off at folio 83. And in that world, when you wrote a memoir or a book or a chronicle, several copies were always made. This was the only, and she's a royal princess. She's a woman of great skills, highly regarded, a matriarch, learned, experienced, the only woman who's invited by the emperor to contribute her memoirs as a contribution towards the official history, which she does after that adventurous trip. So why not another copy, right? So that was one fact. And the second, even more staggering fact was that they had not just gone on the pilgrimage as a group that she led. Within, people could come back in a month's time, having performed the pilgrimage, but they stayed there for 4 years. And I began to think, something in me said to me that the two pieces, that is the broken book, that not the broken, but yes, it is pretty much broken in the sense that there's a voyage. It breaks off mid-sentence on folio 83, that and something that happened in Western Arabia are linked, and lo and behold, they were.
That is such a fascinating story about her voyage. So how did you find the book, and meaning what condition was it in? How did you find also the translation from early 1900s? And how did you then decide with those two pieces to start how you would start putting together your biography of Princess Gulbadan?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I believe I was the last person to actually physically hold Gulbadan's book in the British Library in my hand. It's very fragile. It's there are 83 folios, as I mentioned, 6 by 9.5 inches per folio, um, and roughly 14 to 15 sentences per page. It's written in Persian and calligraphic. It's very beautifully bound red book with a little bit of golden lining. Um, it has this gorgeous aging, stains that rice paper produces itself. Very, very, really very fragile, very tactile. So I had read Annette Beveridge's English translation, which I also think is an extraordinary amount of work that she did. Annette Beveridge has also had an interesting relationship with India. She spent about 30 years in India. She taught in a school. And when she comes back to England at roughly about the same age as when Gulbadan is going to the Hajj 52, she has two very traumatic experiences. She loses two children, and she starts going heavily deaf, and that is the time she begins to learn Persian. So I think it was a skillful book, and the struggle she had in publishing the book. Nonetheless, it's a Victorian translation, so there's a lot of, at different places there's a flattening out of things. So I began reading the Persian the chronicle in Persian, right? And the senses, the colloquial character of the book, the stream of consciousness style of writing, right? It was not as male scholars who knew about this book. I mean, this book has been present in English since 1902, but been marginalized on the grounds that, as one male scholar said, she gets her dates wrong. And I thought to myself, she's not writing a book, she's writing a chronicle. And it's a stream of consciousness style, which is why it's so beautiful. It's based on storytelling. I mean, that was one of the major, forms of literacy and learning, apart from, technical sort of aspects such as calligraphy or the Quran or arithmetic or hunting. You know, the storytelling as a form was a really important storytelling, and you actively see this, and you can almost see why an official woman's chronicle that is totally based on this poetic language, colloquialism, storytelling would not be understood by male historians, right? So all of these things were going on. But basically, to jump forward to how I began to put the pieces together of the 4 years and the missing pages, as I dug deeper, there were two things that I wanted to do. I wanted to really, because on the Mughal side, we had really no active sources of what happened when she left India and went to Arabia. Arabia at that point was under the sovereignty of the Ottoman sultans of Turkey, the great sultans of Turkey. Their forefathers had won it in 1517, including parts of Egypt and that area. So they were away from Arabia, sitting in Istanbul. And one of the ways in which they articulated their authority over that area was to declare, and this is within the terms of and the framework of Islam, they declared themselves as servitors of the holy city, meaning that holy cities, meaning that they would be responsible for everybody living in Arabia, be it visitors, Bedouins, residents, travelers, royal guests. So when Gulbadan goes to Western Arabia, now there are 2 points of view out of which she goes, right? Her nephew gives her the permission to go because it would make him look great. He's already Akbar the Great, but like all emperors, he was highly egotistical, and the millennial was coming. He wanted to be the head of Islam, all of these kinds of things. So that was his ambition. She goes for very different reasons, right? She's an itinerant princess. And yes, pilgrimage is very central to her ethic, to her piety. It's her language. But something else happens. So when I figured out this history, I also figured out that a year into Gulbadan's arrival in Arabia, Sultan Murad had issued an eviction order against her. When I dug deeper, I found out that there were at least 5 eviction orders that are housed in the National Archives in Turkey. And they told the whole story. They told the story. Basically, Gulbadan had gone with tons of, thousands and thousands of arms, formal arms from the emperor to be distributed to the holy sites such as Mecca and Medina or several other places, but also to holy persons. But in addition, the thing that really troubled Sultan Murad, and it is mentioned in each of his eviction orders, there's a word called sadakat, which is translated, it's a form of alms, but it is supposed to be informal way of distribution of alms, but it puts you in the highest ground when you distribute those alms, because the philosophy around that is that it is not the person who's getting the alms, who's healed and taken care of. It's the person who gives the alms that is healed and is opened up and is finding senses of opening their spirit and their soul. And so this sadakat keeps on coming up in every order. And it's by the 4th and 5th. So the women don't leave. That's the important point, right? First year, second year, third year, fourth year, 5 eviction orders. It's when the 5th eviction order is issued, in which he uses the most castigatory term in Ottoman Turkish. It's called nameshru, which literally was used for the most offensive acts, if you will, such as, in the holy precincts of the great mosque in Mecca, the Kaaba, the central shrine, is ensconced, and it has a beautiful covering. So by mistake, if you step on that covering, that's nameshru, right? If you were sauntering about, dirtying the holy precincts, it could be nameshru. So this is the word he uses against her. And of course, nothing in the documents of the Mughals, but immediately as the 5th order was going in, Akbar the Great was sending the next commander of pilgrimage to bring Gulbadan back. And in the official history, there was one line, which is to the side, which said, the ladies did not want to come back home, right? So these are the forms. I mean, that's a very long answer to that. I mean, I'm kind of summing up the whole book, but I think at this point, it's really essential to set the stage for that.
And it's essential to women in the Mughal history too, which might go against what stereotype is. This was a strong group of women, very independently minded. And we should say too that Gulbadan lived for a very long time, 80 years old.
Yeah, she was born in 1523 and dies in 1604.
So she actually lived a lot of this history. Why do you think she was asked to write this book of history?
Yeah, that's so after she returns, and I do want to say that the way I thought about this is very important to the question. One other word that Sultan Murad uses in all the documents, and this became the key to understanding something about Gulbadan's person. I'm very hesitant to say I her inner life. I think in a way we'll never have access to somebody's inner life, but he uses this word called mujawir, which, let's say, spiritual sojourners, right? And there was a whole tradition of people living in Western Arabia, men and women, who did pilgrimage, but they spent long years just admiring the land, learning the traditions of the Prophet at some of the best schools that taught it in that area, learning architecture. The relationship with water and the way it was experimented upon and thought upon, its preservation. I mean, speaking of environment, I became obsessed with cisterns in Arabia, right? How they were designed by Persians, how they were stored, the movement of grains and goods, and all of these kinds of things. So I think, in a way, it's a story about a woman's freedom,
Mhm.
but how she creates it, and how. So coming into the tradition of the Mujawirs by staying longer, because this was not part of the conversation with Akbar the Great, right, with her nephew when she leaves, and her entire group of women, and they stay for, 4 years, and so it's tied to that story of, Gulbadan finding her freedom. So when she comes back, I believe, with this sense of freedom. The harem won't matter anymore. And by this time, Akbar is ready to install the first official history of the empire. And he, because he's, beautifully and fantastically well established, territories have been gained, bureaucratic structures have been laid down, and they're formidable. He's also a very interesting syncretic figure, right? So he's very playful, very thoughtful. So he invites several older male members, servants, caretakers, to record their memories of the forefathers, because any formidable solid history should begin from the beginning, right? Of course, the idea will be, it was called the Akbarnama, meaning the chronicle of Akbar. In the end, he would be the center point, but he had to gain legitimacy, right, by all of this. There was one woman he invited, right, to record her memories, and this was Princess Gulbadan. And his mother, Hamida, was a very close friend, and she was this kind of formidable dowager empress, very forceful. She had served as the governor of Delhi when he had gone on some expeditions at one point. So there'd been any number of interesting, powerful, cerebral women there. But Gulbadan is also the daughter of the first king, sister to the second. She's been witness to the making of the empire. This was really critical. So as men went about writing, um, and their 6 copies each survive, so to speak, right? There may be 4, there may be 6. But classic, sort of, wars, really powerful men, fantastic stuff going on, but all around men. And this is where I believe she began to. This is the only example of prose. Women wrote poetry a lot of the time. There was nothing to go by as a model, and it was never replicated again. So um, uh, I think she was invited for all these qualities, including the experience that I've been talking about and emphasizing. Um, she, but I think she also then turns around and produces a really unique form that was not palatable either to the emperor or to his uh, great chronicler Abul Fazl, his lackey. um, can I actually, for our audience, read a couple of paragraphs on um, what went into the making of that book, right?
Absolutely.
Because her library was fantastic. She had read her father's beautiful memoirs. She had read, along with, with people who were writing alongside her. She knew all the classics. There's a whole chapter, the famous Gulistan, the Garden of Roses, allegories of all kinds. She'll have looked at all these fabulous paintings. I mentioned Hamida. She had um, she had commissioned her own paintings of the Hindu epic called the Ramayana. So some of the finest paintings of that epic were commissioned by her son, the emperor. But the mother, Dowager, she had her own paintings drawn, which are actually in a lovely collection in Doha at the moment. And so she will have seen all of these things. But I kept on thinking, what produced this unique form that and I just want to read just a little bit on that. None of these works, that is, the ones that were in her library or the ones that she was familiar with, served as a literary model for Gulbadan's writing, which differed radically from most court chroniclers of her time. For one thing, her work has no didactic charge. It falls outside the prevalent Mirror of Princes genre, which emphasized pragmatic guidance and the role of rulers as moral exemplars. Instead, the wide world and its people were her books. Her knowledge germinated from gardens, tents, pavilions, caravans, ships, rivers, oceans, deserts, camels, mosques, water fountains, hills, mansions, and the red sandstone harem. Babar, her father, Dildar, her mother, Maham, her stepmother, Khanzada, the aunt she adored, her rose sisters, little Akika, her niece who died in a battle, Bega Begum, another stepmother, the Afghan lady, another stepmother she was very close to, Humayun, her brother, Hamida, the dowager, and so on, were her books. The Portuguese, she was in major tussle with them before boarding the ship. The Surat governor, her nephew Akbar, the Ottoman Emperor Murad, the Sharif of Mecca, the Sharif of Medina, and the local officer in Aden, they were stranded during a shipwreck, were her books. Women in history, Shehzade, Subeda, Fatima, her brave grandmother Isan Daulat, were her books. Experience was her book. Crossing the Khyber Pass in a caravan at age 6, being a young woman in exodus to Kabul, and her time as a sagacious woman lodged in the harem, all informed her writing. Indoors and outdoors, upon the seas or on land, her own body was her experience. Experience is in the body, memory is embodied. She commenced writing from embodied memory and from events as she experienced and thought of them. She created tapestries of court life, domestic life, political intrigues, and ceremonies as she interpreted them.
That is actually a really great lead into my next question. This book is so descriptive about setting, scenery, landscape, domestic places of habit. The Khyber Pass, the crossing of that, I felt like I was this story takes place hundreds of years ago. And I felt like I could see everything that the princess saw. How did you get that down in the book? What research did you have to do to be able to picture everything that the princess was seeing and experiencing?
That's a lovely question, and I'll take it as a question of form. I mean, I think I'm giving you already a sense of the texture of the archive, by way of the eviction orders, imperial histories, any number of recounts by servants and officers, architectural evidence, painting, each of which had its own iconography that I had to be very attentive to, and especially attentive. So this is the last comment on the archive, but I want to speak about the form. I've always shared this with my students, and because I say this to myself, look where you habitually don't look or have been told you cannot look, right? So that one liner, the women did not want to come back, or the one liner that their ship was wrecked, right? All those were one liners. And basically, this is what has happened to feminine experience and feminine history. People know, and yet they don't know them, right? What I tend to call bullet point histories. So and these are living figures. These are people with blood and life and feelings, vulnerabilities, ambition, strength, mind, heart, all of these things. So so I leaned. And so my academic strengths, I'm very grateful for them. But I also found them very ossified. I got very disgruntled by the form, by the argumentative character of things, staking claims, proving people wrong. And with Empress, I turned to a general sort of classification storytelling because I had heard about Noor from my mother as I was growing up. Writing that book was quite a struggle. I mean, it was not, the genre and the transition is not automatic. There was a lot of play. But I think I also thought a lot about what is storytelling? Because to me, I think the form is not given. I think I began to think of the form from the Mughal world, the chronicle form, which is that it's open-ended,
Mhm.
that it can be that it can, and Gulbadan's book is very, very evocative. I mean, it's very visual, and I'd been playing with that visuality since Empress. And here, goodness me, I mean, this book was written during COVID, and I was in Sweden. It was the only one place that was doing in-person fellowship, but we were locked, and I was traveling with this most ardent traveler in my mind, right? I was doing all these journeys. I was thinking, I said earlier, what does 16th century pilgrimage look like? We have these senses from 19th century imagination,
Mhm.
the whole humanity bowing down all in two-piece white clothing. Turned out in 16th century accounts, women actually dressed just the way they dressed when they did the performance of the rituals. um, what was the character of the land, right?
Mhm.
um, what was the texture of the soil? I was obsessed with ships. What kind of 16th century ships did they travel on? Totally obsessed with those, and it was fantastic. There was one episode, and again, so looking where you don't habitually look, I came across in the Mughal documents one letter that the Hajj commander, so the Hajj commander takes them, he performs the first set of rites and returns, while the women are behind. And then he writes this letter to Emperor Akbar before he meets him, in which he recounts an episode in which, from the women were right on the top deck. Two ships sailed together. Women were right on the top of one of the decks, called the Jahaz e Salimi, the ship of Salim, named after the prince, Akbar's son. And the other was Jahaz e Ilahi, that is the ship of divinity. And very large number of passengers were given free pass. It was a state policy. And then there were, of course, tons of staff, and it's a whole cottage that's going. And so from the princess's ship, the Hajj commander reported that a little boy fell off into the ocean, and he recounted a whole rescue operation. As part of that, he wrote that they could not light the lamps on the deck because it would invite sea monsters. And I said, goodness me, which sea monsters in the
Mhm.
16th century, right? So that became an obsession. So it was like, it was a veil of obsessions I was living. Um, yeah, and I don't know if that speaks to the form, but I think that visuality is very key to how, um, there's always, in every chapter I have one visual motive.
Mhm.
I sit with it for days, and then that becomes the chapter in a
Mhm.
way. And I think that's how they began to string together. If
And
that makes
perhaps
sense.
somewhat maybe inspired by how the princess wrote her own history book.
It's very
A
lovely.
very alive, active story.
I was asked exactly this question by your counterpart in Harvard Bookstore. And I think it is true. I mean, I've been obsessed with this book for 20
Mhm.
years. I think it's a book about migration and movement. It's very akin to our story,
Mhm.
having it's very akin to the story of my grandparents and parents who moved during the partition of the Indian subcontinent from the Pakistan side to India side, and mourned the loss, their friends. I've moved around quite a lot in my life, making homes all the time. So uh, it's a story also somewhere behind my mind, always, at least for 5 years now, is this crisis that nation states have produced in our world of
Mhm.
of refugees, right? And how the refugees are treated. I think forever in human history, people have moved and built homes,
Mhm.
right? But it's the nation states that create these horrible ideas of,
Mhm.
this is where you belong, this is your passport,
Right.
we'll wipe you out, you
Mhm.
you don't belong here, and all forms of, we are encountering this. You spoke about it
Yeah,
earlier on.
absolutely.
So I think there are all these relationships with her book, but I think as a
Mhm.
chronicle too, there is a relationship, because I do like the visuality. I'm I'm very in awe of the stream of consciousness. I do want to think about this a lot more, though.
Yes. I want to ask one more question, and then maybe we'll turn it over to the audience
Yeah.
for questions. Obviously, you are the rare historian of women in the Mughal Empire. Not too many of you. What surprised you most about these women?
Yeah, another lovely question. So, with Gulbadan, it was a very, I started my engagement with her and relationship with her as an academic, and I was blown by the book, right? The book from the empire. I was going to get on and write the feminist history. So it was a cerebral relationship. I was very, um, I was very taken. The uniqueness was very clear to me. But as I've gone on and done this new history, completely opened up this new story, and I, I've been in awe of her sense of exploration, of and the desire, and that she'll stay with it. Um, and freedom has acquired so many meanings in my mind, right? It is, first of all, it's not. I think, as I understand it, I think, and it's relevant to me, and she's the guide. Is that nobody's senses of freedom is given, right? It's an exploratory tendency, and then you fashion your own, and you create your own, and then you have that no matter what your circumstances are. Once you have it, you have it, right? So when she comes back to the harem, it's called the return, and the return has so many beautiful meanings. I leaned on Saidia Hartman's work quite a lot to think about the return, right? What the return means, what the freedom means, both of these things. So I think I've been, as I said, it was a very intellectual, cerebral relationship to begin with, but now I'm really in awe of her, right? Her aunt Khanzada, who she so Aunt Khanzada was her father's older sister, and they are descendants of the great Tamerlane of history, and Genghis Khan. And Gulbadan's father, when she was a little girl, before she was a little girl, in fact, before she was born, he had these aspirations of conquering Timur's land in Central Asia called Samarkand, and he loses. And so women always traveled in these wars. He loses um, once. He tries again. He loses the second time. The third time, in the retinue is also this older sister, and he gets defeated. And to run for his life, he promises Khanzada, his sister, with agreement from her, in marriage to the man who defeats him, that is Shabani Khan Uzbek. And it's very interesting. He runs and leaves the women behind, the rest of the women behind. So they trample through, miles and miles of snow. One of the servants in the retinue then actually, comes to India, and one of his concubines later on from India also travels to the pilgrimage. So but when Khanzada Begum comes back 10 years later on, so this is really important to remember. She leaves that man, comes back as this formidable matriarch, becomes a great guide on legal, social, political issues to the dynasty. But there's no stigma attached to what had happened. That's what she did in the interest of the survival of the empire. That's how it was understood in the family. And Gulbadan becomes the best writer on her aunt, right? All of this is documented. And I will want to add, Annette Beveridge, the first translator, actually did 100-page index on women from this entire Islamic terrain, which is not a small job because of the nature of documents that we are talking about. And in that index, you can actually get a history of the number of women who were bartered during these exchanges. Incredible women. So yes, I've been, as you can see, I've been in awe.
Well, we can all now understand why this is such a fascinating topic and why Princess Gulbadan was, why you became obsessed with her and her story, because it's really intriguing. Wanted to see if we had some questions either in the room or online, and ER has a microphone if you are here, if you can ask your question in the microphone.
Anybody want to start us out and be brave in the room? Yeah.
Not so much a question, I guess, or more of a comment, but I want to say thank you for your obsession and your curiosity. Especially right now, I feel like every day I'm kind of mourning the loss of archives as they're happening, every single day. And I think like it's a great reminder for us to look at what we do have. When you were talking about stream of consciousness, I was thinking of Plestia, the journalist who writes those diaries, and the kinds of archives that we can pay our curiosity and attentions to now. And it just makes me think, like, as a nonfiction writer myself, like, where can I look? What margins can I look in more? To kind of keep the joy of curiosity alive while we are, mourning the loss of archive. So more of a statement of gratitude and a reminder for me to keep doing that.
Thank you. That's very kind. Yeah.
Important to
Keep
know.
the momentum going is what I feel. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me, Professor Law. I've had the opportunity to be her student, and it's been absolutely wonderful. It's just been I'm so happy to see you here today. My question is about how you think pre-existing kin structures affect like how we negotiate ways to belong, and how those like ways to belong or like the subversive nature of them has affected you personally as a historian.
Yes. Thank you, Mahi. I think belonging. I think at the heart of some of these writings, especially thinking movement and migration is about belonging, and I think belonging is, in my mind, a bit like the senses of freedom that I was talking about. That nothing about is established, right? How you make a home, how you build structures, how you build, your communities. There's so much about the language of belonging, right? Which language do you want to affine with? Which language you want to attend to? Belonging and citizenship quite often go together. So I begin to think. I was saying this earlier on. How do I think? Who's a citizen? So there's a latent question here, right? I mean, I'd always, growing up in India, this is also the story of a plural upbringing in India. This history, by the way, I do want to say this history, Mughal history, has been wiped out from school textbooks in India and from college curriculum. Under the stringent state of India, and belonging is also so many forms and ways of seeing, being next to each other, and the kind of sympathy that comes by knowing, right, by lack of fear. And I think when you generate that fear, you've already punctured people's senses of belonging. So I think plurality is very much at the heart of this book. So speaking of mourning, I think we are, myself, my partner is here, my, my students, my colleagues in India, we are mourning this plural senses that we've grown up with, right? But I also want to say that, as it happens all the time, there are some fantastic new public movements that are taking place, new conversations in India that are taking place. And my book, amongst others, is very much part of those conversations. So I think a sense of belonging with very deep commitment, at least for myself, to plural ways of being, coexistence, to use that great word, empathy, curiosity, open-mindedness. This is my language of belonging, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that question. Who else has a question?
We have an online question
great.
from Ayana. Ayana says, Miss Ruby, what are some qualities in Princess Gulbadan that you find in yourself?
Great question. Putting you in the spotlight here.
Wow. That's a lovely question. And I'm, as you can tell, I'm generally not very shy of speaking, but but this one is making me feel embarrassed. So I'm the modern Mughal historian of the Mughals, right? And I'm the modern Gulbadan, if that's what you want to hear. The
That's
solo
right.
feminist
Pioneer.
historian,
Right?
Thank you, Ayana.
One of the ways we like to close out is, we think about how books belong on shelves together. And, sometimes we think about it as your book kin, who are you in a book family with? And so when you think about who is in your book family, who are the ancestors for your book, who do you hope you're on the shelf with, or who do you think you're on the shelf with?
Oh my God.
That's a great question.
I love that question. If 2 years ago you had asked me this question during Empress, I wouldn't have been able to answer. But lately, and I say this with great humility, I want to be very, very clear.
Oh, just spit it out. Just spit it out.
I make no pretensions that I'm in that league, but an admirer. This is the great Polish novelist Olga Tokarczuk, and her books of Jacob. It's a 1,000-page tome. I am such a great admirer. My last chapter, the books of Gulbadan, actually is inspired by those 1,000 pages.
Oh,
So
wow.
if my book could be placed right next to it, I will take a shot of it.
I love that, because it's not necessarily an intuitive thing, but one of the things that we love is the ways that different genres can inspire each other, and different cultures, so that's wonderful. Thank you both so much for this beautiful conversation. Thank you to everyone watching virtually. We really appreciate you. We're going to encourage our virtual friends to click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Vagabond Princess from Karis. You can also buy Ruby's previous books. You can also buy Anjali's books, The Parted Earth and Southbound, from Karis. So just click through and do that. We're going to say goodnight to y'all. We really, once again, appreciate you being